The air was crisp that morning, a quiet calm settling over the suburban streets of Cleveland. The roads glistened faintly from the remnants of the early morning dew, and the sound of car engines humming through the neighborhood signaled the start of another routine day. The world moved as it always did, oblivious to the tragedy that was about to unfold. Rosemarie Essa gripped the steering wheel of her SUV as she made her way down the familiar road, heading toward a local theater where she planned to meet her sister for a movie. She was a woman in her prime, young, healthy, and full of life. Her home was a picture of stability, a marriage to a successful doctor, and two beautiful children waiting for her return. But something was wrong. A wave of nausea surged through her, the kind that didn't feel ordinary. She swallowed hard, trying to shake off the unease creeping into her chest. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, pressing a number she had dialed countless times before. "Eva," she managed to say as soon as her friend picked up. Her voice wavered, barely a whisper. "Something's wrong. I don't feel right." On the other end, Eva McGregor's heart clenched at the distress in her best friend's tone. She sat upright, suddenly alert. "What do you mean? Are you okay?" I, I don't know," Rosemary stammered. "I took a calcium pill this morning, the one Yaz gave me. But now I feel so strange. My chest is tight. I'm dizzy." Her breath hitched. Eva felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "Rose, pull over. Right now, just stop the car." But Rosemary never got the chance. As she tried to focus on the road, a sudden, overwhelming weakness overtook her limbs. The edges of her vision blurred, dark spots dancing in front of her eyes. The SUV swerved slightly, drifting toward the curb. Panic surged in her chest as she fought to maintain control, but her body wasn't responding the way it should. The wheel slipped from her grasp, and then impact. The sound of metal scraping against concrete jolted nearby pedestrians into alarm. It wasn't a violent crash, not the kind that sent debris flying or twisted steel into unrecognizable shapes. It was minor, a glancing blow against the sidewalk, enough to leave a dent, but not enough to suggest disaster. But inside the vehicle, Rosemary slumped forward, her breathing shallow, her lips parting in a final attempt to speak. Within minutes, bystanders rushed to her aid. A man knocked on the driver's side window, his face etched with concern. "Ma'am, are you okay?" She didn't respond. Another voice called for help. A woman dialed 911, relaying what little she understood of the situation. A driver who had lost control, a car that had barely crashed, and a woman who now appeared unresponsive. The paramedics arrived swiftly, their training kicking in as they assessed the situation. At first glance, there were no signs of trauma, no broken bones, no external injuries that could explain her condition. But something was wrong. Her skin was unnaturally pale, her pulse weak. As they lifted her from the driver's seat and into the ambulance, her body felt limp, as if drained of life before they even had a chance to intervene. The hospital was only minutes away, yet time stretched endlessly as the emergency team worked to stabilize her. She wasn't conscious, but she was still breathing. Barely. Doctors and nurses surrounded her the moment she arrived at the ER. The attending physician frowned as he reviewed her vitals. A young woman in seemingly good health shouldn't be like this. The initial assumption was a sudden medical episode, perhaps a heart attack, a stroke. But something about it didn't make sense. There was no history of underlying conditions, no warning signs before today. And then, just like that, Rosemarie Essa took her last breath. The monitors flatlined. The room fell into an eerie silence. Efforts to revive her were in vain. The team worked tirelessly, following every protocol, exhausting every possibility. But the reality was undeniable. She was gone. A perfectly healthy woman, a mother, a wife, had died without warning. The shock settled in like a heavy weight. Doctors exchanged glances, uncertain of what had just happened. There was no apparent cause of death, no logical reason for her body to simply shut down. It was as if something had stolen the life from her in an instant. Some deaths made sense, ones caused by illness, by injury, by visible trauma. But this was different. This was sudden. This was unnatural. And somewhere beyond the sterile walls of the hospital, the truth lurked, waiting to be uncovered. The world didn't stop when Rosemarie Essa died, But for those who knew her, everything had changed. It wasn't just grief that settled in, it was confusion, an unsettling sense of wrongness that no one could quite put into words. In the days following her death, the atmosphere in the Essa household was thick with sorrow. Yet beneath the mourning lay something else, something unspoken. Friends and family gathered, offering condolences, filling the silence with murmured words that felt hollow in the face of a loss that made no sense. There was no warning, no illness, no accident. Just a woman who had been full of life one moment and gone the next. And no one seemed to have an answer. The doctors at the hospital struggled to explain what had happened. There was no trauma, no aneurysm, no underlying condition that they could detect. The preliminary report suggested sudden cardiac arrest, but to those who had known Rosemary, that wasn't good enough. People don't just die like that, not without a reason. Yazid Essa, the grieving husband, presented the image of a man devastated by loss. He was a well-respected doctor, a man admired in the community, someone who had built a seemingly perfect life with his wife and 2 children. From the outside, it looked like the ultimate tragedy, the loss of a devoted wife and mother. But those who observed him closely noticed something strange. He wasn't inconsolable. He wasn't lost in grief. He was composed, detached, too controlled in his reactions. He accepted condolences with polite nods, spoke about Rosemary in the past tense with a certain detachment, as if she had been gone much longer than just a few days. Some attributed it to shock. Others, especially those who had been close to Rosemary, couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unnatural about his response. Eva McGregor, Rosemary's best friend, watched him carefully. She wanted to believe he was just a man struggling to process his wife's unexpected death, that his lack of tears was simply his way of coping. But she knew better. She had listened to Rosemary's fears over the years, had seen the subtle changes in her friend's demeanor whenever she spoke about her marriage. There were things left unsaid, small cracks in the perfect facade that now felt more significant than ever. Rosemary had loved Yazid, but she hadn't trusted him. She had confided in Eva about his infidelities, the lies she had caught him in, the sense that something in their marriage wasn't right. She had never been able to prove anything, had never outright accused him of more than betrayal. But the doubt had been there, gnawing at her, an unspoken fear she had tried to suppress. And then there was that last conversation. Eva kept replaying it in her head, the way Rosemary's voice had trembled when she mentioned the calcium pill. It had seemed insignificant at the time, just a passing comment, but now in the wake of her sudden death, it felt like a puzzle piece waiting to be placed. She had said she wasn't feeling right. She had said she felt dizzy. And then, minutes later, she had lost control of her car and died. It wasn't a coincidence. The funeral came, a gathering of those who had loved Rosemary, who wanted to say their final goodbyes. People whispered watching Yazid, trying to decipher the puzzle of his grief. His eulogy was carefully worded, his voice never wavering. He spoke of Rosemary's kindness, her role as a mother, but there was no raw emotion behind his words. When it was over, mourners lined up to offer their sympathies. Yazid accepted them with brief nods, murmured responses. When Eva took his hand, she searched his face for something real. His fingers were steady, his eyes dry. It was as if he had already moved on. The murmurs of doubt began to spread. Some whispered that maybe he had been prepared for this, that maybe, just maybe, Rosemary's death hadn't been so sudden for him. The Essa marriage had never been as perfect as it seemed. Rosemary had spoken of her doubts, her fears, but never in full sentences, never in accusations. She had been careful, too careful, and perhaps most hauntingly, she had once said something that now echoed in Eva's mind like a warning she hadn't understood in time. If something ever happens to me, promise me you'll look into it. At the time, Eva had laughed it off, telling Rosemary she was overthinking things, but now she wasn't so sure. Now her best friend was gone, and the only thing she had left was a lingering suspicion that the truth had been buried with her. The idea that Rosemary's death wasn't natural began to take shape. It was a whisper at first, a quiet doubt that settled in the corners of conversations. But then, the questions became harder to ignore. Why had a healthy woman suddenly collapsed? Why had she felt unwell after taking a pill given to her by her husband? Eva voiced her concerns to Rosemarie's family. The hesitation in their eyes told her they had been thinking the same thing. They wanted answers. They needed them. And there was only one way to get them: an autopsy. The hospital had initially listed Rosemarie's cause of death as sudden cardiac arrest, but her family wasn't satisfied with that conclusion. They requested a full toxicology report, but results would take time. Time they might not have, because while they were searching for answers, Yazid was preparing to leave. He was packing, making arrangements. He wasn't waiting for toxicology reports or explanations. He wasn't demanding justice for his wife. He was getting ready to move forward. Eva knew deep in her bones that if they didn't act fast, Yazid Essa would be gone before they could even ask the right questions. The days after Rosemarie Essa's death stretched on like a fog, thick with unanswered questions. What had started as an incomprehensible tragedy was now shifting into something far more sinister. The pieces weren't fitting together, and those who had loved her the most could feel it. They didn't have evidence, didn't have proof, but they had instinct. And instinct told them that something was very, very wrong. Eva McGregor couldn't get her last conversation with Rosemarie out of her head. The dizziness, the chest tightness, the calcium pill. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than a passing comment from a friend who wasn't feeling well, but now it was the only thing that made sense. Something had made Rosemarie sick that morning, something that had set off a chain reaction that ended with her dead in a hospital bed. People don't just collapse out of nowhere. People don't just stop breathing without warning. So, what had really happened? The request for an autopsy had been met with initial hesitation. The hospital had already ruled Rosemarie's death as sudden cardiac arrest, an explanation that allowed them to move on, to file the paperwork and mark her passing as another tragic event that couldn't be helped. But her family wasn't satisfied with that. They demanded more. They needed to know why. And so the toxicology report was ordered. Waiting for answers was the worst part. Toxicology results took time, and while they waited, life continued. But it didn't continue in the way that it should have. Yazid wasn't mourning his wife the way a man should. He wasn't drowning in grief. He wasn't broken by her loss. Instead, he was making plans, moving forward. It started with small things. A mention of possibly selling the house. A conversation about arranging care for the children while he sorted out his next steps. Then there was something bigger. He spoke to family about needing a fresh start, about considering leaving the country for a while. It wasn't grief that was pushing him forward. It was something else. Eva noticed. She wasn't the only one. And as much as she tried to ignore the sinking feeling in her gut, she knew what it meant. If the toxicology results confirmed what she already suspected, there was a very real possibility that Yazid wouldn't be around to answer for it, because men like him didn't wait around to be caught. The results came back weeks later. The official document, sterile and clinical in its wording, told a story more horrifying than any of them could have imagined. It was cyanide poisoning. The news spread through the family in waves, each person reacting with the same mix of shock, horror, and understanding. Because now it made sense. Cyanide, a toxin that worked quickly, cutting off the body's ability to absorb oxygen. A poison that could mimic a sudden medical episode, one that would leave little trace if no one was looking for it. It was the kind of thing that didn't end up in a person's system by accident. Someone had done this to Rosemarie. The doctors at the hospital had missed it. The initial assumption of cardiac arrest had nearly let it go undetected. But the toxicology report had caught what the human eye couldn't. The calcium supplement she had taken, the one Yazid had given her, had been tampered with. The reality of it was chilling. The thought that someone had planned this, had carefully orchestrated the death of a woman who had been full of life just hours before she collapsed. It wasn't a moment of passion, an accident, or a terrible mistake. It was deliberate, and now there was no denying it. Law enforcement was contacted immediately. Investigators arrived at the family home, collecting statements, gathering whatever evidence they could. They took everything: medical records, prescriptions, bottles of supplements from the bathroom cabinet. They spoke to the doctors who had treated Rosemary, retraced every step of her final day, searching for more pieces to fit into the puzzle. The investigation moved quickly once the poison was confirmed. Cyanide wasn't something that could be explained away. It wasn't something that accidentally ended up in a person's system. This was murder, and the closer detectives looked, the clearer the picture became. Rosemary had felt fine before she took that pill. She had been talking, planning, laughing, and then within minutes her body had begun shutting down. The symptoms, dizziness, confusion, loss of muscle control, lined up exactly with cyanide poisoning, and yet there had been no external signs. No violent struggle, no traumatic injuries. That was the terrifying part. It had been clean, precise. Whoever had done this had known exactly what they were doing. Suspicion narrowed quickly. The timeline was clear. The only person who had given Rosemary anything to ingest that morning was her husband. Detectives worked through the details. They spoke to Rosemary's friends, her family. They heard about the cracks in her marriage, about the concerns she had voiced in whispers. They dug into Yazid's background, his habits, his movements in the days leading up to his wife's death. Then came the discovery that sealed everything. A purchase. A recorded transaction showing the online purchase of cyanide just weeks before Rosemary's death. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't explainable. It was exactly what it looked like. Premeditation. But when investigators arrived at the Essa household to question Yazid, he wasn't there. He was gone. The questions that had haunted Eva and the rest of Rosemary's loved ones had been answered in the worst possible way. Rosemary hadn't just died. She had been killed. And now the man who had spent weeks pretending to grieve her was running. The race had begun. Now it wasn't just about justice. It was about catching him before it was too late. The moment Yazid Essa vanished, the case shifted from a homicide investigation to an international manhunt. Law enforcement had no illusions about what this meant. People didn't run unless they had something to hide. And the speed at which he disappeared only confirmed what everyone had begun to suspect. This was never meant to be an unsolved mystery. It was meant to be the perfect crime. But perfect crimes don't exist. When investigators arrived at the Essa home to question Yazid, they were met with an unsettling silence. His car was gone. His phone went straight to voicemail. No one had seen him. His family, when questioned, appeared confused, but their uncertainty rang hollow. They claimed they didn't know where he had gone, but their responses were careful, their wording precise. It wasn't outright deception, but it was enough to raise suspicions. He had planned this. This wasn't the impulsive act of a grieving husband overwhelmed by the weight of loss. This was the calculated escape of a man who had anticipated that the walls would close in. He had left before the police had even officially declared Rosemary's death a homicide. He had left before the toxicology report had even reached the public record, which meant he had known, and that changed everything. The first few days of the investigation were crucial. Law enforcement traced his last known movements, combing through financial records, surveillance footage, and phone logs. They found what they were looking for almost immediately: a flight, one way, booked under his name. Destination: Beirut, Lebanon. It was a chilling discovery. Lebanon didn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. If Yazid made it there, it would be nearly impossible to bring him back. He could disappear into the country, rebuild a life beyond the reach of U.S. authorities, and never face justice for what had happened to his wife. And that wasn't an accident. This wasn't a man running blindly, desperate and reckless. This was a man who had a plan. The problem was that catching him wouldn't be simple. He had a head start. He had resources. And he had connections, ones that made law enforcement's job significantly harder. They reached out to Interpol, launching an international alert. But the reality was bleak. Yazid had been careful. He had left behind no trail of distress, no indication of fear or panic. If anything, his actions suggested that he had been waiting for this moment, that he had always known this day might come. And yet there were cracks in the plan. Investigators worked tirelessly to reconstruct his timeline, interviewing friends, colleagues, anyone who might have had insight into his intentions. They pieced together fragments of conversations, small details that had once seemed meaningless, but now painted a disturbing picture. There had been talk of travel, vague mentions of needing to get away after everything. There had been financial transactions, large withdrawals that suggested someone consolidating funds before a move, and then there had been the purchase of cyanide, a purchase that had been made weeks before Rosemary's death. Premeditation. It wasn't just an escape, it was a calculated disappearance. But Yazid had underestimated something. He had assumed that people would move on, that grief would cloud judgment, that the truth would be buried beneath bureaucracy. He had assumed that his medical background, his charm, and his carefully crafted image would shield him from scrutiny. What he hadn't counted on was the tenacity of those who loved Rosemary. Eva McGregor had become the loudest voice demanding justice. She wasn't just asking questions, she was making noise. She contacted the press, reached out to anyone who would listen, made sure that Rosemary's story didn't fade away. And she wasn't alone. The media picked up the case quickly, broadcasting images of Yazid's face, highlighting his sudden disappearance, emphasizing the damning toxicology report. His name spread across headlines, turning him from a respected doctor into a wanted fugitive. And for a man who had built his life around control, that was a dangerous shift. The search widened. Authorities tracked known associates, examined his possible escape routes. They flagged his passport, monitored international travel records, coordinated with agencies across multiple countries. And then a lead, a sighting. A man matching Yazid's description had been seen in Cyprus. It wasn't Beirut, it wasn't Lebanon, it was a deviation from the plan, and that meant something had gone wrong. The moment law enforcement knew he had made a misstep, they moved quickly. They worked with Cypriot authorities, coordinating an effort to track him down before he could disappear again. It took time, but time was running out for him too. He had fled, yes, but running wasn't the same as escaping, and now, for the first time since he had vanished, there was hope that he wouldn't get away. The disappearance of Rosemarie Essa had transformed the case from a homicide investigation into an international spectacle. It was no longer just about finding answers. It was about bringing a fugitive to justice before he slipped into the shadows permanently. The speed of his escape had confirmed what investigators feared from the beginning. He had planned for this. He had anticipated that the moment Rosemary's toxicology report came back, there would be no more doubt. Now it was a race. The FBI, working alongside Interpol and local authorities in multiple countries, began piecing together his movements. He had been spotted in Cyprus, an unexpected deviation from the original belief that he had gone straight to Lebanon. That meant something had disrupted his plan, forced him to make an adjustment, and that was the best chance law enforcement had to catch him. The problem was that Cyprus was just another stepping stone. It wasn't his final destination. The challenge wasn't just finding him, it was predicting where he would go next. Investigators combed through financial records, searching for transactions that might indicate his whereabouts. But he had been careful. He had liquidated assets before he left, withdrawn cash in large sums, making it difficult to track his spending in real time. He wasn't using credit cards, wasn't making phone calls that could be traced. He had gone dark, relying on networks of acquaintances, distant relatives, and possibly people who owed him favors. But no matter how carefully he covered his tracks, he couldn't stay hidden forever. The media frenzy surrounding the case had grown exponentially. News outlets broadcasted his face across international channels, making it nearly impossible for him to move unnoticed. For someone who had spent his life enjoying power and control, who had thrived on a carefully cultivated image of success, the idea of being a wanted man must have been unbearable. The pressure was mounting. Law enforcement suspected he had chosen Cyprus as a temporary hiding spot because of its proximity to Lebanon while still offering easier movement options. But that also meant he had to keep running. He couldn't stay in one place too long, not with authorities closing in. Then came the breakthrough. A tip came in. Someone had recognized him. It was a sighting in a small cafe just outside Nicosia. He had been alone, wearing sunglasses, speaking quietly in Arabic to a man who seemed uneasy. The person reporting it hadn't immediately realized who he was, but later when they saw his face on the news, they knew. Cypriot authorities moved quickly, securing surveillance footage from nearby establishments. The video was grainy, but it was enough. He was there. The operation to capture him was delicate. If he caught even the slightest hint that he was being hunted, he would vanish again. And if he made it to Lebanon, there would be little hope of ever bringing him back. They monitored his potential movements, trying to anticipate his next step. He wasn't staying in high-end hotels or luxury resorts. He was keeping a low profile, moving through lesser-known accommodations, likely relying on contacts to help him. That meant there were people aiding him, and that made things even more dangerous. Authorities knew that if they waited too long, if they didn't move at the right moment, he would be gone again. They couldn't afford to lose him. The net was closing in. They coordinated with local law enforcement, setting up surveillance in key areas, tracking leads in real time. Every movement, every whisper of his whereabouts was analyzed. The cafe sighting had been their best lead yet, but it wasn't enough. They needed to catch him in transit before he could disappear onto a plane, a boat, or even into an underground network that would make him untouchable. Then it happened. A second sighting. This time at a transportation hub. A man fitting his description was seen purchasing a bus ticket. It was the first tangible proof that he was still in Cyprus. This was the moment. Authorities moved in. The sting operation was swift, methodical. Officers spread out, blending into the background, watching every exit, anticipating every possible escape route. There was no room for error. And then they saw him. He was walking toward the terminal, carrying only a small bag, looking over his shoulder once, briefly before stepping toward the boarding area. For a moment it seemed like he might slip away again, but before he could take another step, officers closed in. The arrest was quick, too fast for him to react, too precise for him to fight back. In the span of seconds, Rosemarie Essa, the man who had thought he could outrun justice, was in handcuffs. The chase was over, but the battle had only just begun. The arrest of Rosemarie Essa in Cyprus sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the media. The man who had evaded capture for months, slipping through international borders like a ghost, was finally in custody. But even as officers placed him in handcuffs, as his name was confirmed, as the weight of his crimes began pressing down on him, there was a chilling reality that authorities understood immediately. Capturing him was only the first step. Bringing him back to the United States would be another battle entirely. Extradition was rarely a straightforward process, and in this case it was bound to be even more complicated. The Cypriot legal system had its own protocols, and extraditing a foreign national, especially one involved in a high-profile case, would require meticulous coordination. The United States had issued a warrant for his arrest, but that didn't mean Cyprus would simply hand him over. And Yazid knew that. From the moment he was placed in a holding cell, he began working the system. He was a doctor, intelligent, and methodical, and he had spent his entire life navigating complex situations with precision. Now he turned that skill toward self-preservation. He hired legal representation immediately. High-powered defense attorneys, well-versed in international law, stepped forward to fight his extradition. They argued that sending him back to the U.S. would violate his rights, that he wouldn't receive a fair trial, that he was being unfairly targeted by the media. For weeks, the case remained in limbo. Legal teams on both sides prepared for battle. The prosecution laid out the facts, the toxicology report, the cyanide purchase, the methodical nature of his escape. They painted a picture of a man who had carefully planned the death of his wife, who had ensured she would die in a way that initially appeared natural, who had orchestrated his own disappearance the moment things unraveled. But Yazid's lawyers pushed back just as hard. They painted him as a victim of a legal system that had already declared him guilty in the court of public opinion. They argued that there was no physical evidence directly linking him to the poisoning, that the case against him relied on circumstantial evidence, on assumptions rather than proof. And they knew exactly what they were doing. The longer they delayed the extradition process, the more time Yazid had to strategize, to find ways to slip through legal loopholes, to secure another escape plan if necessary. He wasn't fighting this battle for justice. He was fighting it for time. Meanwhile, in the United States, frustration grew. Rosemarie's family was forced to watch helplessly as the man they believed had murdered her sat in a cell, working every legal angle to avoid facing consequences. Public pressure mounted. The media covered every development, turning it into a spectacle. Would he be extradited? Would he manage to escape justice once again? Then came the most dangerous moment of all, the extradition hearing. It was the deciding factor. A judge would determine whether Yazid Essa would be sent back to the United States or whether he would remain in Cyprus, where he could potentially secure freedom in ways that would never be possible in America. Law enforcement feared the worst. The thought of him walking free, slipping back into the world with his resources and connections, was terrifying. But the evidence was overwhelming. Despite the arguments from his defense, despite his legal team's attempts to cast doubt, the court ultimately ruled in favor of extradition. Yazid Essa would be sent back to the United States. The ruling was a victory, but it didn't mean the danger was over. There was still the matter of physically transporting him. Authorities couldn't afford to take chances. A fugitive as high-profile as Yazid could still attempt to escape, could still find a way to manipulate the situation in his favor. Security was tightened. Every step of the extradition process was carefully planned. Law enforcement escorted him onto a secure flight, ensuring there would be no opportunities for interference. There were no stops, no room for error. For the first time since his escape, he was going home, but not on his terms. When the plane touched down on American soil, it was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Yazid Essa was back. Now the real fight would begin. The return of Yazid Essa to the United States was a victory, but it was not the end of the battle. His capture had been a critical turning point, yet it was only the beginning of what would become an intense and drawn-out courtroom war. Now the legal system would have to do what law enforcement had fought so hard for: bring him to justice. The prosecution knew that convicting him wouldn't be easy. The case against Yazid was strong, but not ironclad. There were no eyewitnesses. There was no video. There was no direct physical evidence tying him to the cyanide that had killed his wife. What they had was a timeline, a pattern of behavior, and a motive so undeniable that it spoke for itself. And they would have to make the jury see what they saw. Rosemarie Essa had been a healthy woman, with no medical conditions that could explain her sudden death. That much was undisputed. The toxicology report had confirmed the presence of cyanide, a poison so deadly that it acts within minutes. That was also indisputable. The real question was how it got into her system, and why. The prosecution was meticulous in laying out the events leading to her death. They began with the most critical piece of evidence: the calcium pill. On the morning of her death, Yazid had given Rosemary the pill. That was a fact. She took it, drove away, and within minutes began feeling ill. That was also a fact. The cyanide had been ingested, and Yazid was the last person who had access to what she ingested before she died. But suspicion alone was not enough. The defense knew that, and so did the prosecution. The prosecutors strengthened their case by introducing Yazid's own search history, financial transactions, and medical knowledge. The jury listened as the prosecution methodically presented the purchase records for cyanide, made just weeks before Rosemary's death. A controlled substance, nearly impossible to obtain without specific intent. It wasn't something people accidentally stumbled upon. Then came the autopsy report. It detailed how cyanide shuts down the body, how it deprives the blood of oxygen, leading to an almost immediate loss of motor function. The prosecution connected it to Rosemary's final moments: the disorientation, the nausea, the inability to control her vehicle. It was textbook poisoning. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, but Yazid's defense team was relentless. They countered at every turn. They argued that there was no direct proof that Yazid had laced the pill with cyanide. There were no fingerprints, no surveillance footage, no confessions. They painted a picture of a grieving husband being unfairly targeted because he had left the country, claiming he had been in shock and unable to process the loss. They attempted to cast doubt on the toxicology report, suggesting that contamination or improper handling could have led to false results. They called expert witnesses to the stand, trying to poke holes in the forensic analysis. And perhaps most chillingly, they suggested that Rosemary could have poisoned herself. It was a desperate angle, one that sent a wave of outrage through the courtroom. But the defense knew that in a murder trial, reasonable doubt is everything. They didn't have to prove Yazid was innocent. They only had to make one juror question whether the prosecution's case was airtight. The turning point came when the prosecution introduced the personal accounts of those who had known Rosemary best. They called Eva McGregor to the stand. Eva, the best friend who had heard Rosemarie's fears firsthand. Eva, who had listened to her say, just days before she died, that she didn't trust her husband. Eva, who had received that last phone call, the one where Rosemarie said she didn't feel right after taking the pill. She testified about the cracks in their marriage, about the affairs, the deception, the growing distance, about how Rosemarie had joked, not once, but multiple times, that if anything ever happened to her, it wouldn't be an accident. And then, the prosecution unveiled the most damning evidence of all. They played a series of recorded phone calls between Yazid and one of his mistresses. Calls made before Rosemarie died. Calls in which he spoke about wanting to be free. Calls in which he spoke about a future without his wife. Calls in which he hinted at things that, in hindsight, sounded less like fantasies and more like a plan being put into motion. The courtroom was silent. There was no emotional outburst, no confession of guilt. But there was something else, something even more telling. For the first time since the trial had begun, Yazid looked uncomfortable. The confidence, the arrogance, the mask he had worn so well, it cracked, and that was all the jury needed to see. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. Every seat was filled, every set of eyes locked onto the jury box, where 12 men and women sat in grim silence. They had listened to weeks of testimony, seen the evidence laid bare, watched as the prosecution methodically unraveled the life of Yazid Essa. His secrets, his infidelities, his carefully constructed lies. Now it was their turn to speak. The judge had given his final instructions, reminding them of the weight of their decision. The jury had been sent to deliberate, and now the world waited. For Rosemarie's family, the wait was agonizing. They had lost her in an instant, with no chance to say goodbye, and for years they had lived with the unanswered question of why. Now they knew. They had seen it unfold in court, had listened as the truth was pieced together. But knowing the truth and getting justice for it were two different things. The defense had fought ruthlessly to create doubt. No fingerprints, no surveillance footage, no recorded confession. It wasn't enough to suspect that Yazid had killed his wife. The jury had to be certain. The prosecution had worked tirelessly to paint the picture of premeditation, the cyanide purchase, the phone calls, the affairs, the lies. But at the heart of it all, this case wasn't just about evidence, it was about intent. Yazid Essa had wanted freedom. He had wanted his life without the weight of a divorce, without the division of assets, without the inconvenience of legal battles. He had wanted the easiest way out, and in his mind, that way was Rosemarie's death. But would the jury see it that way? The deliberations stretched into hours, then into a second day. The anxiety in the courtroom grew unbearable. News outlets dissected every possible outcome. Legal analysts debated the strength of the case. Would a lack of direct evidence be enough to set him free? Or would the overwhelming circumstantial evidence be the rope that finally tightened around his neck? The waiting continued. For Yazid, the pressure was visible. He had walked into the courtroom each day with an air of confidence, as if he were untouchable. But as the hours passed, that confidence cracked. His legal team whispered in hushed voices, occasionally throwing glances his way, calculating the odds. By the third day, the jury had reached a decision. The courtroom was called back into session. Spectators filled every available space, their breath collectively held. This was the moment. Rosemarie's family clutched hands, silent prayers echoing in their minds. Justice had eluded them once. Would it elude them again? Yazid sat still, his expression carefully controlled, but his hands resting on the defense table were clenched tighter than before. The judge asked the foreperson if the jury had reached a verdict. They had. The moment stretched out like an eternity. We, the jury, find the defendant, Yazid Essa. The pause was suffocating. Guilty of aggravated murder. The words rang through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps, tears, the weight of justice crashing down all at once. Rosemarie's family broke down, years of grief and frustration spilling out in waves. Eva McGregor felt a shudder run through her body, a mix of relief and exhaustion. They had done it. Yazid's expression didn't change, but for the first time there was something behind his eyes. Fear. He had spent years outrunning the inevitable. believing he could manipulate the system, believing he was smarter than those who pursued him. But now the system had caught up, and this time, there was no escape. The judge set the sentencing date, but everyone already knew what was coming. A life sentence. No chance of parole for at least 20 years. For Rosemary, it wasn't enough. No punishment could bring her back. No sentence could undo what had been done. But for those who had loved her, who had fought for her, it was the closest thing to justice they would ever get. The case was closed. The verdict was final. But the consequences of what had happened would last forever. The verdict had been delivered. The gavel had fallen. The case was closed. But justice was never as simple as a courtroom declaration. A guilty verdict did not erase the pain, did not fill the empty space where Rosemary once existed. It did not bring her back to her children, who would grow up without a mother. It did not undo the years of deception, the carefully calculated betrayal by the man who had once vowed to love and protect her. It did not erase the grief. For Rosemary's family, the emotions were complex. Relief, yes. Relief that Yazid Essa was finally where he belonged, that he would not be able to harm anyone else. But there was also an overwhelming sadness, an exhaustion that settled deep in their bones. They had fought for years to see this moment, had endured delays, courtroom battles, legal maneuvers designed to stall justice, and now that it was over, the silence was deafening. They had won, but at what cost? The trial had been brutal. It had forced them to relive Rosemary's final moments over and over again, to sit in a courtroom and listen to attorneys dissect her life and death as if she were nothing more than a case file. They had been forced to hear the defense suggest that maybe, just maybe, she had been responsible for her own death. They had watched as Yazid sat there, expressionless, as if none of it mattered, and now he was gone, locked away, serving a life sentence in a prison cell. It should have felt like closure. But grief was never so easily contained. For Ava McGregor, Rosemary's best friend, the victory felt hollow. She had been the first to suspect something was wrong. She had been the one to remember that phone call, to push for the toxicology report, to refuse to let Rosemary's death be written off as an accident. And yet the reality of what had happened still haunted her. She thought about the warning signs, the uneasy conversations, the confessions of distrust. She thought about how many times Rosemary had hesitated before speaking, how many times she had brushed aside her own fears, trying to believe that things weren't as bad as they seemed. Had she known? Had she sensed, even in some small way, that Yazid was capable of this? The thought was unbearable. The world moved on quickly, as it always did. The headlines shifted to new stories, new crimes, new scandals. But for those who had loved Rosemary, there was no moving on. Her children were left to grow up without her, their memories of her frozen in time. Her parents carried the unbearable burden of outliving their child, of waking up every day knowing that the man they had once welcomed into their family had been the one to destroy it. Her friends lived with the guilt, the lingering question of whether they could have done more. And Yazid? He was exactly where he belonged. Yet somehow that still didn't feel like enough. In prison, he was no longer the respected doctor, no longer the man who had once walked with confidence, believing himself untouchable. He was now just another inmate, a man who had traded a life of luxury for a cell, a man whose arrogance had finally been shattered by the weight of his own actions. And yet, he refused to admit guilt. Even after the conviction, even after the sentence, he never once confessed, never once acknowledged the truth that everyone else could see so clearly. He had always believed himself smarter than those around him, always believed he could manipulate the system, twist reality in his favor. But the one thing he had never counted on was the strength of the people who refused to let Rosemary be forgotten. In the end, that was what had brought him down. Not just the evidence, not just the trial, but the people who had loved Rosemary enough to fight for her, even when she could no longer fight for herself. Her story was not just one of betrayal and loss. It was a story of justice, a story of resilience, a story of those who refused to let evil win. And while justice could never bring Rosemary back, it ensured that her killer would never walk free again. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.